Okay, welcome once again, ladies and gentlemen. This is our last conference for the day, so we hope that all of you will enjoy speaking. Our first speaker is Maurice Isserman from Hamilton College, and he's going to talk about a revisitation of a thesis that he put forward several decades ago, and it did a lot to kick off the interest in our subject. So we have certainly an all-star panel here, and I hope all of you will enjoy it.
So the 12-hour day was abolished in the steel industry in 1920-something, but this is like the long turn, if you have read that novel. I brought some artifacts, and I bring our artifacts to my classes. Can everybody hear me, by the way? So much so that I'm told that my nickname among students at Hamilton is Professor Artifact. And this artifact is a first edition Harvey Klehr, Heyday of American Communism, the Depression Decade, which I bought hot off the press in 1984. It has my annotations in it and my underlining. So let's begin the bidding. Okay, so this is my book, which came out 2 years earlier. Which side were you on? In 1982, History of the Communist Party during the Second World War, which opened with the words, "The history of communism in America is bitterly contested terrain. The passions aroused by the debate over differing interpretations of that history are seldom far removed from contemporary concerns," end quote. And in fact, thinking back on it, I just reread it for the first time in this millennium. I don't think I actually believe that. Because I was responding to books that had been written decades earlier. The Fun for the Republic book series already alluded to, the Howe and Koser American Communist Party Critical History, which was 1957. I began my research in 1977. And what I thought I was doing, as opposed to what it turned out I was doing, was to balance the Draper-Howe-Koser emphasis on Moscow's central role, all-important role, in shaping the policies and outlook of the CPUSA throughout its history, which is not something I ever disagreed with, and I refer you to my book. But I thought I was going to balance that with the consideration of other factors, generational, national, and so forth, which complicated the narrative of the history of the Communist Party in the 1930s and 1940s in useful ways, which is why, looking back naively, I made a pilgrimage to Princeton, where Theodore Draper was then ensconced at the Center for Advanced Institute for Advanced Studies, and kind of presented my thesis, to which he was sort of non-committal. And also, when came a few years later, when the book was in press, I solicited a blurb, a jacket blurb from Irving Howe, and he wrote back, and it's not on the paperback, and I can't remember the exact quote, but he wrote something like, "This book, quote, stirred me to disagreement," which I guess is better than some of the other things it could have stirred him to, and so I put it on the back cover. It was Irving Howe's name. Contested terrain turned out to be an understatement. I confess contributing my own share to the polemical exchanges which followed, which again took me somewhat by surprise. In particular, when Harvey and I first met at the OAH in the spring of 1985, coinciding with that, the first of Theodore Draper's two-part series attacking the new historians of American communism came out, and not being wise in the ways of academic world, I assumed my career was over. ignoring P.T. Barnum's injunction that make sure they spell the name right. And so I was outraged and insulted. I mean, he called us yuppies, which, if those of you who remember the era, was a grave insult. And you remember FDR's dog Fala, who after being attacked in 1944 was never the same dog afterwards. And much the same could be said of me, alas. But I wonder if, we were talking about this earlier today, not only the post-Cold War generation of graduate students, but generations to come, are going to make any sense of the bitterness, the contested terrain that seemed to divide us during the last years of the Cold War and for some time thereafter. Whether they're going to say, well, what exactly were they arguing about? They seem, at least after the initial combat took place, to not have such substantial differences. And here I would like to quote Randy, writing in Perspectives on History in October 2000 on the significance of the revelations of the Moscow archives for future histories of the CPUSA, in which she suggests, in a self-critical tone, that some of the people who began emphasizing local sources and generations, as I did, and some such, may have exaggerated. These historians, she wrote, did not always grasp the significance of being a member of an international movement dominated by the Soviet Union. Because the Communist Party was an international movement operating through democratic centralism, it was inherently different from any other American political organization, which I think are wise words. So in the same self-critical spirit, let me offer a few comments on changes I would make if, God forbid, I was ever tempted to revise Which Side Were You On, knowing now what I, couldn't really have known then, but should have known then. So I have 5 all told. Number 1, I would say something about espionage. And not just something, but quite a bit. The term espionage does not appear in the index of Which Side Were You On. The concept itself is not referred to except indirectly, in a single time, by implication, in connection with Karl Marzani's post-war indictment for having falsely denied Communist Party membership when he was recruited for the Office of Strategic Services. The names Julius and Ethel Rosenberg do not appear in the book. The Radosh Milton Rosenberg file, which persuaded me immediately of Julius's guilt, appeared a year after my book was published. The name Steve Nelson, already mentioned this afternoon, does appear in Which Side Were You On a number of occasions. I interviewed him in October 1977, which proved very helpful in shaping my understanding of the outlook of the secondary leadership of the Communist Party in the Browder years, the people who were coming up through the Young Communist League and were in their 20s or 30s. But I never asked him about, and indeed didn't know to ask him about, the accusations of his own involvement with atomic espionage. My sole consolation is that I was not alone in my omission of what we now know is the major part of the Communist Party history. 10 years after Which Side Were You On was published, Klehr and Haynes would write, quote, "Few American communists were spies, and espionage was not a regular activity of the American Communist Party," close quote. They would soon change their minds, of course, and were scrupulous enough to quote their own earlier misjudgments when they did so. I never thought I'd be citing Donald Rumsfeld favorably on a historical or any other question, but as he famously observed on one occasion, there are known knowns, known unknowns, and of some relevance here, quote, unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know, close quote. And unknown unknowns describes our collective blind spot about espionage in the 1980s pretty accurately. Secondly, so more espionage, more Pete Seeger. There is some Pete Seeger, but only by you have to be an aficionado to know it, because there are two epigraphs in the book which are taken from Almanac Singer's lyrics, both from the Yanks Aren't Coming era. But Seeger himself never makes an appearance. Of course, my main focus was on the Communist Party's cadre, the secondary leadership, people who were Seeger's age, but who were actually playing important roles in leadership, and moreover, tended to be second-generation Americans. So they were first-generation native-born, people like Johnny Gates and Joe Clark and George Watt and so forth, which describes neither Seeger's role nor his background. Still, of all that generation of young communists, he went on to have the greatest political and cultural impact in the United States. I think Stanley Levison might be the runner-up in that regard. I recently completed a review of a new book about the Weavers, the group that Seeger and friends, the group that they organized in 1949, which went on to great success for a year or two in the early 50s, much to their surprise. And I learned for the first time that in that book, that the famous picture of Martin Luther King Jr., which was plastered on billboards all across the South in the late 50s, showing Martin Luther King at Communist Training School, i.e. Highlander Folk Center, was taken while King was in an audience listening to Pete Seeger singing civil rights songs. And about the same time, Pete was tweaking the lyrics of the old hymn, which had been picked up from the church to the labor movement, "We will overcome," into "We shall overcome." So in Seeger's, thank you for the drinks. In Seeger's Pilgrim's Progress from the callow youth of 1940, dutifully parroting the party line about FDR the warmonger, "I hate war and so does Eleanor, but we won't be safe until everybody's dead," to the beloved elder of 2009, heartily croaking the lyrics of "This Land Is Your Land" alongside Bruce Springsteen at Barack Obama's inaugural concert, there are ironies and inconsistencies, but also at least a partial fulfillment of what was best in the values that at one time drew bright and promising young people into the ranks of the communist movement. Third, I would do more to explain. Listening today, I keep saying, I should change that because people have already said it better than I'm going to do. But I would do more to explore the aspect of the Communist Party's political culture that involved what we would today call fake news. A prime example that I did cite in Which Side Were You On is a Daily Worker headline from January 20th, 1940, quote, "Lincoln, Brown," that's John Brown, the abolitionist, "Lincoln, Brown, Browder, colon, names Negroes revere," which is somewhat of an exaggeration, and might have struck the Daily Worker's readers at the time as such. But I wonder how communists rationalized this alternate reality. And I think it went something like this, if I was going to explore this at greater length. Lincoln and Brown were despised by many in their own day, just as Browder was in 1940. That Browder would perhaps one day eventually be a revered name among Negroes, and perhaps his name would be revered among other Americans as well, may well have made the headline easier to swallow, not as a literal truth, but as it were a prefigurative truth, a truth in the process of becoming true. This capacity for self-deception and walled-off media belief bubbles, unfortunately, was not restricted to the Communist Party USA, nor to the distant past. Number 4, pay more attention to the largest grouping of communists in America, which is to say, ex-communists. The Communist Party, we know, was a revolving door. It attracted hundreds, thousands of recruits every year, many, perhaps even most, of whom, after 3 months, 6 months, a year, decided it wasn't for them. Maybe not with some great Kronstadt moment, but just because it was boring or it seemed pointless or they didn't like the people they were doing their party activities with, or some other reason. By the time the Communist Party reached 75,000 or so members at the end of the 1930s, I would guess, and you'll note the imprecision of my estimates here, but there must have been at least as many ex-communists in the United States as actual communists, and perhaps many more. And one of the themes I've heard referred to today is placing Communist Party history in larger context, and this is one of those larger contexts. I mean, the Communist Party, considered as an organization of 75,000 people in a nation of 130 million, doesn't sound like a lot, but the Communist Party, considered over a period of 2 or 3 decades as involving literally hundreds of thousands of people, many for only a brief time, some for longer periods, is somewhat more substantial. And I wonder about these ex-communists, which is not the same thing as anti-communists. A minority of them became open anti-communists. Maybe many more were closeted anti-communists. But I suspect a lot of them simply regarded this as a poor judgment they had made in their past. What was their relationship to the party? Did they continue to read the Daily Worker after they stopped paying dues because the Daily Worker circulation was greater than the Communist Party membership? How many became active anti-communists? Most, certainly by the early 50s, must have feared the possible consequences of their past membership becoming known. And you didn't have to be a communist for 10 years or longer to get into trouble. And being a communist for 3 weeks could get you into trouble in the McCarthy era. What steps could they take to obscure their membership, avoid the possibility of falling afoul of a congressional investigating committee for past transgressions? Oops, 5 minutes. Yeah, I think I'll do that. How did they manage relations with friends and relatives still in the party? One of the other things I learned from that book about the Weavers is that Charles Seeger, the ethnomusicologist and father to Pete, had been a Communist Party member. I knew that in the 20s and into the 30s. But what I didn't know was that he read the transcripts of the Moscow trials in 1935 or 36, I guess, and left. That was it for him. He didn't publicly break, and of course, when Pete joined the YCL at Harvard, and then became the Pete Seeger of the Almanac Singers and the Weavers and so forth, he kept his counsel. He didn't say anything. But 20 years after he left the party, in the mid-50s, he was denied a U.S. passport on the basis of past party membership, and perhaps because of the notoriety of his folk singer's son. How often were similar scenarios played out among the generations over those years in other families? And finally, and this was something else I was trying to get at earlier today, but not very successfully in my counterfactual question. In the revised edition, I would address the so what question, which I didn't speak to in Which Side Were You On? The narrative logic of my book assumes the possibility of alternate endings. Had different political choices been made by American communists during the Second World War? What if Browder had not been deposed in 1945? What if the Communist Party USA had remained the Communist Political Association? What if the mild reforms to party outlook and practice that Browder initiated remained in place following the Second World War? What if they'd gone even further to a genuine questioning of Leninism and a genuine break with Soviet control, anticipating the Eurocommunism of the 1970s, the Italian Communist Party and so forth? Would it have made any difference? I think not. A Browderite Communist Political Association would still have faced the furies of McCarthyism. Browder himself would likely have been convicted and gone to prison under the Smith Act, along with other CPA leaders. It's not like anti-Stalinist alternatives or non-Stalinist alternatives in the Socialist Party or the Independent Socialist League or others on the US left had a much better time of it in the post-war political and economic climate. the cultural, economic, and political forces that would erode working class support for far more powerful communist, socialist, social democratic, and labor parties in Western Europe, beginning in the 1970s and continuing to the present, simply arrived 30 years earlier in the New World. New forms of radicalism would emerge in time, to be sure, on the basis of very different circumstances, demography, and outlook than that of the pre-World War II Marxist parties. But I would argue, in a revised "Which Side Were You On?", that the Communist Party's time in the United States had come and gone by 1945, irrespective of the policies its leaders embraced or the political repression it would contend with. So that's what I wanted to say, and now I'm going to reopen bidding, having gotten a kind of tepid response the first time around. Thank you.
Let me introduce you. During the 1980s, almost anybody who was a historian and who was interested in the left would be certain to attend any convention that featured both Maurice and Harvey Klehr. Their debates should have been recorded for posterity. They were excellent, and every one of us left questioning many of the things that we had taken for granted. So Harvey Klehr from Emory University has his 15 minutes now.
Okay. Thank you, and I wanted to thank the organizers. It's been a very, very interesting, if tiring, day. More than 30 years ago, shortly after I published The Heyday of American Communism, The Depression Decade, and I do want to cut from whatever you get from that, the simmering tensions about how to study the CPUSA came to a boil. My interpretation followed in Theodore Draper's path, one which regarded the CPUSA as an American appendage of the Soviet Union and attributed its failures to its slavish obedience to Soviet foreign policy. The book elicited a wide range of reactions. Many of those that appeared in academic journals were written by scholars critical of this view, who argued that the party had been rooted in a genuine American radical tradition, had more autonomy than either Draper or I believed, and at least for some period of time had represented a promising alternative to America's capitalist system. The most prominent and respected interpreter of the American Communist movement and a fearsome polemicist, with skills honed in the communist movement he had abandoned years before, Draper wrote a two-part essay that Maurice referred to for the New York Review of Books, excoriating the new historians of American communism, many of whom had emerged from the new left of the 1960s and 1970s and admired various aspects of the CPUSA and sought lessons for contemporary radicals from its history. They had disliked my book, denounced its harsh portrait of the party, and laid many of its sins on Draper's own supposed fixation on the Soviet Union and refusal or inability to credit the innovation, resourcefulness, independence, or flexibility of the generation of young men and women who had joined the party beginning in the 1930s. For many of the revisionists, as they were styled, the collapse of the CPUSA was an American tragedy, brought on primarily by Red Scares and repression, not allegiance to an undemocratic foreign regime. The polemical war that followed Draper's essay still lingers on, but without most of the vitriol it generated for more than a decade. The opening of new archival sources in both the former Soviet Union and the United States has provided enormous amounts of new information. I was reminded of this history this past summer. Over the years, I have taught at least 9 or 10 National Endowment for the Humanities summer seminars for high school teachers on the topic of communism and American life. For the last 3 or 4, I have invited Maurice to come to Atlanta for a day and present his views on the CPUSA as a counterpoint to mine. In past years, we were intellectual antagonists, frequently portrayed as offering diametrically opposed visions of the CPUSA. We often reviewed each other's books, not always positively. In July, this summer, we talked about what we would say at this conference. We were trying to figure out what in the world were we going to talk about. Maurice allowed that if he were to rewrite, and he talked about it a few minutes ago, if he were to rewrite Which Side Were You On, widely considered the revisionist counterpoint to my book, the only thing he would fundamentally change is his discussion of espionage by American communists, which didn't appear, as he notes, in that book. And he noted traditionalists like myself and John Haynes had barely mentioned the topic in our works, and indeed, 10 years after his book appeared, we made that comment he quoted about how espionage was really a minor issue. Now, I have great respect for Maurice and the work he's done on the subject of American communism. When John Haynes and I wrote In Denial in 2003, we explicitly absolved Maurice of some of the mistakes, tortured evasions, and obtuse reactions of many revisionists to the material that had emerged from Russian and American archives after the end of the Cold War. At one conference, Maurice complained that he had been cast as the good revisionist in our book. I replied, and I still believe he should simply accept the compliment. So today I want to suggest that while I applaud Maurice's willingness to come to terms with the widespread espionage that members of the CPUSA engaged in, I think that it, and one or two other revelations from post-Cold War archival releases, actually strengthens considerably the traditional interpretation of the CPUSA that both Draper and myself put forth. It's certainly true that in the heyday of American communism, I did not discuss espionage at any length. But in a section on the life of the party, and I was inspired to go back and reread it after this summer, I noted that the party, quote, included both a legal and an illegal apparatus, the latter sanctioned and required by the Comintern, end quote. I detailed some of the instructions and preparations that the CPUSA was told to carry out this order, and identified J. Peters as the director of the illegal apparatus. I accepted Whittaker Chambers' testimony about Peters and the communist underground in Washington in the 1930s. I noted that some American communists were recruited for espionage, and in a footnote cited Elizabeth Bentley's claim about Earl Browder's participation in such special work, a phrase I noted that was well known within the party as a euphemism for activities in the underground. In short, while espionage was certainly not a major focus of the book, I believe that the stories about communists who engaged in it were not anti-communist fantasies or efforts to discredit the CPUSA, but part of its normal operation. What I missed, of course, was that espionage and special work was far more extensive than I had dreamed. The Venona decryptions, the Mitrokhin documents, and the Vasiliev notebooks demonstrated that more than 500 Americans, virtually all of them members of the Communist Party or very close sympathizers, assisted Soviet intelligence agencies between the 1930s and the end of the 1940s. That is, as some critics noted, only a small percentage of the total Communist Party membership, which at its height in the late 1930s came to some 80,000 people. But it is not a negligible or insignificant number. Moreover, the Communist Party as an organization was deeply involved in recruiting and vetting these intelligence assets. Its conspiratorial apparatus, or underground organization, run by senior party cadres, at first Peters, later Rudy Baker, fully cooperated with both the KGB and GRU, procuring false American passports and vetting proposed Soviet agents. Close aides to Earl Browder, Jacob Golis and Bernard Chester, served as liaisons to the KGB. Communists with Comintern connections, like Steve Nelson, the party leader in the San Francisco Bay Area, accepted money from KGB officers and cooperated with their espionage efforts. Browder himself knew about these operations and approved them, occasionally himself recruiting agents. In the early 1980s, when I researched and wrote The Heyday of American Communism, I could not believe that the Communist Party as an organization would be so intricately or deeply tied to Soviet intelligence because of the enormous risks that it entailed. Since the party knew it was under constant FBI surveillance, and since it was constantly charged with being a Soviet tool, it would have been running a remarkable risk to be so mixed up in espionage. Could it possibly have been so reckless, so mindless of confirming the charges of its worst enemies, so insouciant about embarrassing its friends and allies? Yes. Why was I so wrong? And why were the revisionists even more wrong? Because the Communist Party calculated that it could avoid and evade responsibility for its actions by attacking turncoats and defectors as liars, and stories about spying as provocations and fantasies. But more fundamentally, because its loyalty to the Soviet Union and its interests trumped the great risks that it ran by getting involved in espionage. And even after some of the party leaders who were involved in this espionage left or were expelled from the party, they remained silent. In part, no doubt, because of concern that they might face indictment. Neither Jay Lovestone, who of course became a fierce anti-communist and worked for the CIA, or Earl Browder, or Steve Nelson, or Max Bedacht, or Gene Dennis, ever owned up to what they and the CPUSA had done. While it is the most important marker of the party's loyalty to the interests of the Soviet Union to emerge from the archives, espionage is not the only one. I want to mention only briefly a small but significant indication of how, even at the height of the Popular Front, the period in which revisionists claimed the party most demonstrated its independence from the Soviet Union, party policy was hostage to Soviet control. In 1936, the Communist Party adopted the slogan, somebody referred to it earlier today, "Communism is 20th century Americanism," as part of its Popular Front strategy. But the Comintern, which had already warned Earl Browder not to get too carried away in his enthusiasm for FDR, instructed the party's representative in Moscow in 1938 to convey the news back to New York that the slogan should be ditched. The Comintern representative, Sidney Bloomfield, wrote to Georgy Dimitrov that the slogan was popular and had influenced many people. It had been used, he said, in, quote, all our literature and agitation, end quote, for 2 years. He had not been told why the slogan should be dropped, and he pleaded with Dimitrov for an explanation. We have not been able to locate Dimitrov's response, but the slogan ceased appearing in party literature. In 1939, Browder gave a half-hearted explanation in The Communist, the party's theoretical journal, about why the slogan had been dropped. He never mentioned, of course, that it had been done on Moscow's orders. He explained that he had formulated the slogan in 1935 to answer red baiters who charged that communists were anti-American. He insisted that the slogan had played a positive role in dissolving the old sectarian and nihilistic approach to American history formulated, and I was surprised by this, Charles Beard, and adopted by the pre-war Socialist Party. But, he said, the slogan was scientifically inexact. It had a nationalistic tinge, and it denigrated the universality of Marxism-Leninism. But no, not to fear. To prepare for the following year's 20th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of the United States, the party was going to inaugurate a deep study of its own history. And the text for this undertaking, I thought this had to be satire. The text for this undertaking was to be an English translation of Joseph Stalin's short course in the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. as if the history of a small, secretive, anti-democratic organization that took power in a coup against a democratically elected government in a backward country with virtually no tradition of democracy or freedom was the proper model for the United States. The Comintern also closely monitored and oversaw the leadership of the Communist Party of the United States. In 1934, it rejected a party proposal to enlarge its political bureau, and it named 6 of the 8 members of the bureau, giving the party the freedom to name 2 junior members. In 1936, André Marty, on behalf of the Comintern, objected to 3 of the proposed nominees to the political bureau. One of those to whom he objected, Clarence Hathaway, was a few years later expelled from the party. This audience does not need reminding that in 1929 and again in 1945, Moscow upended the leadership of the party. In the former case, it ousted Jay Lovestone, just elected as General Secretary with the support of 90% of the membership. In the latter case, via Jacques Duclos, it denounced Earl Browder's policies, paving the way for his expulsion. In the late 1950s, with a full-fledged factional battle for control of the party underway, Moscow signaled its support for William Foster's faction through a favorable review in a Moscow journal by Gene Dennis's American-born but Soviet-reared son of a Foster book. And upon reading the review, Dennis threw his support to Foster's policies. At the same time, the Communist Party leadership was busy covering up the murder of hundreds of American Finnish communists who had emigrated to Soviet Karelia in the early 1930s to help build socialism. Party representatives in Moscow knew that almost all the adult males who had emigrated had been arrested and shot. When some surviving family members made it back to the United States, they were warned by the party to keep quiet. And they did. Any political organization that had ceded control of those leading it, the slogans it used, and the policies it followed can hardly be called independent. And what do we call a political organization that covered up the murder of its own members whom it had encouraged to emigrate? The Comintern was sometimes willing to slacken the rope, but it was always fully capable of yanking it tight and bringing its vassal to heel. Party members, particularly during the Popular Front era, might have labored under the illusion that the Communist Party made its own decisions and was independent, but the party leadership was under no such illusion. And so too were party cadres who were longtime members. They had endured enough sudden reversals of line to understand that Soviet foreign policy drove American party decisions. On the most consequential policy of the 1930s, anti-fascism, the Communist Party, in the course of little more than 1 decade, went from considering Trotskyists a greater danger than Nazis, to calling for a popular front against Nazis, to insisting that there was no difference between Nazis and Great Britain and France, to shaking hands with J.P. Morgan to defeat the Nazi menace. The latter was particularly gruesome since Morgan had been dead for about 2 years when Browder made that suggestion. While only a small percentage of American communists assisted Soviet intelligence, the number who did so was large enough, and knowledge that there were comrades entrusted with special tasks widespread enough that it was a party norm not to inquire closely into either the party's status or activities of anyone else. To believe that most communists were ignorant of the extent to which the party was hostage to the Soviet Union is to disparage the intelligence of those who joined the party. Party literature and party propaganda prominently featured hosannas to the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin, and party meetings constantly reiterated the glorious role played by the USSR in every aspect of world affairs and the superiority of the Soviet system for ordinary people and workers. In comparison to Soviet democracy, America was a sham democracy. Is it any surprise that a political party with that kind of track record was widely despised, not only on the political right, but among many liberals and left-wingers? Thank you.
Dr. Katie Sibley brought to our debates the views of a member of a younger generation, perhaps a woman's perspective made some difference, perhaps not. But most of all, she brought an incredible amount of energy. And it was Katie, Dr. Sibley, who works here at Williams, to get...
But I worked with, anyway, I'd love to be here, but I'm at St. Joe.
Sorry, you're right. Too many beers, they're free. In any case, she brought this incredible energy into the very area that is espionage, where so little had been written. And so we'll now hear from Katie with talk about some of her books.
I'm actually going to, it's interesting, thank you very much. I'm going to be channeling, just like Vern did earlier, I'm going to be channeling Ellen Schrecker, but espionage is a very good connection because Ellen Schrecker was moved by the revelations that Harvey and John made and others to bring forward a new interpretation. So pretend I'm Ellen at the moment. I'm very sorry that she could not be with us. She was going to be on this panel too because she's a longtime scholar. You may know that she wrote Many Are the Crimes about McCarthyism. So here I go, Ellen. As a card-carrying anti-communist, I have a major confession to make. Way back in the pre-Venona dark ages, I put together a slender volume containing an essay with documents about McCarthyism for classroom use. A few years later, Venona was released. I immediately contacted my publisher to demand that we put out a revised edition. The original text of The Age of McCarthyism contained a discussion of the Rosenberg case that implied that Julius Rosenberg may have done something, but, and I quote, whether or not Rosenberg was a Soviet agent remains unclear. Thanks to Venona, however, it had become perfectly clear that Rosenberg was a Soviet agent. Accordingly, that unfortunate section of the book had to be revised if I was to hold my head up in serious historical circles. This kind of reminds me of when I discovered that Warren G. Harding had actually had a baby with, I really didn't want to go there, but the DNA, seemed to confirm it. So yeah, I can empathize with her. Oh, 23, close enough.
23.
I made a few more, now I'm back to Ellen again. I made a few more emendations and produced a second edition that contained, among other documents, a few key snippets from the Venona decrypts. Yes, American communists spied for the Soviet Union during World War II. Rosenberg and his spy ring, as we have already heard, of course, from Steve, did give some useful technical information to the Kremlin. Ted Hall gave much more important material about the bomb, and the group of left-wing civil servants that Elizabeth Bentley fingered also helped the Russians. The Communist Party was involved in all this with some of its top leaders facilitating the process. The evidence for Al-Jahis was somewhat less convincing because he seemed to have been working for the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Agency, not the KGB. And as far as I can tell, the GRU has yet to yield its secrets to outside scholars. Talked about that earlier. So what does it all mean? Communists spied, and that seems to have been their main crime, though they were hardly angels, and the CPUSA was in many ways a disastrous organization. But it's also clear that the espionage Rosenberg and the others were involved with was pretty much ended once the Cold War intensified. Even before the Truman Loyalty Security Program went into effect, party members and their allies were being ejected from government positions. Within a few years, the anti-communist purges achieved their aim of eliminating the threat of communism from the United States. But they also eliminated all the individuals, ideas, and organizations associated with it from any positions of influence within American society. The personal costs to the individual victims of that witch hunt were serious indeed, mainly in lost jobs and ruined careers. Even though, unlike in more repressive societies, only 2 people were killed and several hundred went to prison. But the more serious damage was to the American polity. The political spectrum narrowed, and in both domestic politics and foreign relations, many reasonable and even beneficial options were completely marginalized. They were tainted with communism or even socialism, which was nearly as bad. I could list the specifics of these losses, as I assume most of you could as well. There was the elimination of concerns for economic justice in the civil rights movement, the loss of the well-informed China hands in the State Department that contributed to the debacle in Indochina, etc., etc. In short, despite the fact that we now know that the American Communist movement was perhaps more deeply flawed than those of us writing in the pre-Venona days had realized, the anti-communist furor we call McCarthyism was too heavy a price to pay for eliminating the not-so-serious threat that it may have posed. Thank you.
Our final contribution tonight comes from an award-winning filmmaker, Glenn Gebhard, who's been working with communists and ex-communists of more recent vintage for 15 or 20 years. And I just want to add one other thing. Glenn has the remarkable distinction of being a coast-to-coast scholar. He lives in New York, and he teaches at Loyola of Los Angeles. So this is someone who can hopefully lift our message to a much larger audience by putting it on film.
Thank you, comrade.
Anytime.
I've known this guy for 20 years. So. I'm not going to, my presentation is more a video than reading a paper, but I want to give you a little background. In late 90s, early 2000s, I started attempting to make a film about the American Communist Party. I have done a series of films about Cuba, the last one being released recently, PBS, called Cuba, the Forgotten Revolution. And I just was interested in indigenous communism. So I somehow got a hold of the Communist Party, and I went into the Communist Party and started shooting video until they cut me off. So I wasn't able to finish the film, but this footage, the beginning of this video you're going to see is what I was able to shoot, and I put together a little presentation for you. You know, by the end of my shoot, they started calling me comrade. So I felt, holy shit, I'm a comrade. That's cool. So, but anyway, so this is shot in New York, in Denton, Texas, with the Young Communist League, and I asked them, what's it like to be a communist in Texas? And they said, it's not easy. So, and then I went on a demonstration. I was in a van with Sam Webb, who had taken over the party, to a demonstration in Washington, and it was just me and a busload of communists, so it was very interesting. At one point, I went into New York to interview Gus Hall, and I was with my mom, who was alive at that point. I said, you want to wait in the coffee shop? I'm going to go across the street and talk to some communists. She said, no, I'll come with you. So we went in, and they were decorating this hall, the holiday party. And we started talking. They came around. Everybody was joking. I said, what are you trying to do, turn my mother into a communist? And they all laughed. Anyway, so that's the first part. The second part of this video, I put a compilation together of how the communists were viewed in media. And I start off in 1939 during the Popular Front era with, and I have these kind of these watchwords. I say curiosity. They weren't the devil at that point with Ninochka. In 1943, they were our friends. So I have a scene from Mission to Moscow where Stalin looks like a pretty good guy. 1949 and 1962, the post-war Red Scare, terror, and U.S. government films. I have a couple of those. In 1964, it was a watershed moment when somebody could actually say, shit, you know, a year ago with the Cuban Missile Crisis, we almost killed each other. Let's have a little sarcasm here. So I have a little scene from Dr. Strangelove. In 1982, there was nostalgia, and it was with Reds. And then I end off with humor and disregard with Seinfeld. And by the way, I'm really thrilled to be here, and I've read most of the books that you have all written in some of my research. I'm trying to do a film about Earl Browder and William Foster during the 30s. Whether that comes to pass or not, I think it will.
It should.
Yes. So I'll just start with this. The first little segment is me shooting American communists. I mean, filming, not shooting. And then it's going into these little clips about how the party was viewed. So it's about 20 minutes, and that will end, or hopefully ends up with a little levity, and that ends our day.
Right here is the bestseller.
Why do you suppose that's the bestseller?
Because it's the truth.
But the Communist Party is the only party that I know of that stands for the labor movement, that stands for the little man.
I think the party keeps everyone young because they keep you mentally young because we know what's going on in the world.
They're the ones who have the answers. It's based on Marxism, Leninism.
If you're as terrified about what's going on with politics and the government right now as I am, then you should join the Young Communist League.
We all have to do what we can to make a difference.
Santa Claus is a communist.
So you don't have to harden the message in that room.
Oh, that's all right.
Well, I'm Gus Hall, and I'm the national chairman of the Communist Party of the United States. We believe that socialism is the solution to the problems that we not only face now, but we're going to face in the future.
It is a vast right-wing conspiracy, end of quotation. Right from the very beginning, it was a vast conspiracy.
It's a struggle for the party to get the word out, that's true. Most of the mass media still kind of boycotts us. The mass media kind of tries to isolate the party. But I think we're breaking through in many areas, and that's new for us. This thing's going to go worldwide very quickly. There are all kinds of television stations who want this stuff.
That was very good.
So I guess we should review our work that we've done this semester, and maybe we could talk about how our work has affected people's perceptions of us on this campus and stuff like that.
Okay, my name's Matt Barker, and I'm currently the chair of the University of North Texas Young Communist League Club.
I mean, that's like I said earlier, we're in Texas, man. That's a lot of work. To take a freshman and be like, okay, we're gonna break everything that you've been taught in your life. You're gonna change every religious precept you have. And education does that, but those people have to be able to do it on their own. You can't do it for them.
When I first heard about communism, it was things my parents told me or things we learned about in school, and I guess at first I was pretty horrified of communism. Of course, I never actually met a communist during that whole time, during my formative years. Anything I knew or thought about communism was just hearsay and conjecture. I ran into several communists in the Dallas area, and it was just my interaction with them and watching what these people did and the kind of conviction they had and all the great positive things they were doing and organizing. Eventually I joined the Communist Party, and you know, ever since then I've been involved with it, and now the Young Communist League. Who's going to the showdown tomorrow in Austin?
I'm going as well, so we'll both be going.
China, Texas 2. The next wage slave is gonna be you.
Peace! Now! Peace!
We're headed to Washington, D.C. to a demonstration tomorrow that seems to be, it's going to be big.
Okay. It's always said. It's always said. Hold it back. When I was elected the national chair, it wasn't simply me replacing Gus Hall. And that was an element of it, but there was a larger element to it. It was a change in the generation that was leading the party. The old generation that was leading the party had been leading the party for a number of decades, actually. Most of them were young during the Great Depression. They fought against Hitler fascism, and they rebuilt the party. We began the process of rebuilding the party after the McCarthy period, and we still had to live with the Cold War for the next 35 or 40 years too. We grew up during the 60s and 70s, came out of those movements and those struggles. That was our formative experience, and that shaped our outlook and approach to politics. Welcome to Washington. So why don't we do this? Why don't we and Pat stay here? We're going to have people coming here.
Yeah.
And then we'll swing by the Union Station and drop off whoever, us the papers, and then the two vans can go over to the west side of the Capitol and set up.
Yeah.
And around noon or shortly after, there'll be a march from here to a Navy facility about a mile and a half away. The war is part of a global policy of domination, world domination by the Bush administration. I don't think there's any question about that.
My favorite boyfriend. My favorite boyfriend.
Let each
I be of any assistance to you?
You might hold this for me.
I'd love to.
Correct me if I'm wrong. We are facing north, aren't we?
Facing north? Well, now, I'd hate to commit myself without my compass. Pardon me, are you an explorer?
No, I'm looking for the Eiffel Tower.
Good heavens, is that thing lost again? Oh, are you interested in a view?
I'm interested in the Eiffel Tower from a technical standpoint.
Technical? No, I'm afraid I couldn't be of much help from that angle. You see, a Parisian only goes to the tower in moments of despair to jump off.
How long does it take a man to land?
Now, isn't that too bad? The last time I jumped, I forgot to time it. Let me see now, the Eiffel Tower. Your finger, please.
Why do you need my finger?
It's bad manners to point with your own. There, the Eiffel Tower.
And where are we?
Where are we? Now, let me see, where are we? Here we are. There you are, and here am I. Feel it?
I'm interested only in the shortest distance between these 2 points. Must you flirt?
Well, I don't have to, but I find it natural.
Oh, Mr. Stalin.
Mr. Davis, I'm happy to know you.
It's a great pleasure, sir. Also considerable of a surprise. Won't you please sit down?
Besides your work here in Moscow, I understand you have visited many other sections of the Soviet Union.
I've been greatly impressed by what I've seen. Your industrial plants, the development of your natural resources, and the work being done to improve living conditions everywhere in Russia. I believe, sir, that history will record you as a great builder for the benefit of mankind.
It is not my achievement, Mr. Davies. Our 5-year plans were conceived by Lenin and carried out by the people themselves.
The results have been a revelation to me. I confess I wasn't prepared for what I found here. You see, Mr. Stalin, I'm a capitalist, as you probably know.
Yes, we know you're a capitalist. There can be no doubt about that.
We also know this, Mr. Davis. The worst things you've had to say about us, you've said to our faces. The best things you've said to our enemies.
We want you to realize that we feel more friendly toward the government of the United States than any other nation.
In recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. If he openly declares himself to be a communist, we take his word for it. If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist. If a person supports organizations which reflect communist teachings, or organizations labeled communist by the Department of Justice, she may be a communist. If a person defends the activities of communist nations while consistently attacking the domestic and foreign policy of the United States, she may be a communist. If a person does all these things over a period of time, he must be a communist. But there are other communists who don't show their real faces, who work more silently.
I've heard some rather disturbing reports about you.
Such as?
Such as the fact that you're spending so much time with people who are nothing but communists.
Nothing but communists. Well, maybe there's nothing but communism for people who aren't afraid to think. Look, Dad, if you want to find out how I stand on anything, just ask me. Don't waste your time by listening to a lot of stupid.
You don't know what you're saying, Paul. You don't know what communism really means.
No, but I'm learning. And what I'm learning makes more sense to me now than anything I've ever learned before. Your world is dying, Dad, and it's burying itself in the dry rot of imperialism and colonialism. Communism is building a new world right in front of your eyes, and you can't see it.
I saw communism at work before you were born, Paul. I remember the horrible senseless violence, the bitterness. I saw the terror in Kiel and Berlin.
You remember a man named Hitler? That's where your violence came from. But people like you couldn't see that either until it was too late.
Paul, let's not quarrel about history. Think about America, our country. It's been good to us. Well, but all this happened.
I remember when you made that speech at a 4th of July picnic. I was about 12. It sounded great. Then. But somehow you sideways never get around to mentioning wars, depression, big business government, bigotry, Middle Eastern oil, the China lobby. What's the matter? Don't you read between the headlines?
No matter what you say, Paul, and no matter how big our problems are, there's still the most important thing of all. We have freedom here. Freedom to make what we can of our own lives.
Freedom to conform. Freedom to make the proper responses when somebody pushes the propaganda button.
Эти Америки папиросы, они очень хорошие. Speak English, comrade. Remember, that is about the only freedom you do not have in this town. It's American town. Americans, they have too many freedoms. That is another thing you must remember, comrade. For one day it will be your mission to destroy those bourgeois capitalist freedoms.
Frightening, isn't it? From all appearances, this community could be in Iowa, California, or Tennessee. It looks like an American town. As American as apple pie and ice cream. As a matter of fact, you can find apple pie here and ice cream too. But appearances are deceptive. This is not an American town. However, it may be assumed that such a town does exist, shrouded in secrecy and protected by utmost security, deep behind the Iron Curtain. You might call this a college town, communist style, as part of a long-range plan to destroy our free way of life. These young communists are studying the economic, political, and religious institutions that are the very heartbeat of America. The courses here in this strangest of all schools: espionage as a science, propaganda as an art, sabotage as a business. This nameless American city, deep in the vastness of the Soviet Union, it stands as a symbol of Russian treachery, of long-range communist conspiracy.
You don't let that lousy commie punk vomit all over us like this.
Mr. President? We haven't been able to reach Premier Kissoff in the Kremlin. They say they don't know where he is and he won't be back for another 2 hours.
Try B86543 Moscow.
Yes, sir.
You would never have found him through his office, Mr. President. Our Premier is a man of the people, but he is also a man, if you follow my meaning.
What did you say? I said Premier Kissoff is a degenerate atheist.
Mr. President, I formally request to have this ignorant brute.
I'm sorry,
Mr. President, I think they're trying the number.
You filthy bully, you filthy guy! I'll taste you out before, eh? You war mustang boy!
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room. What is going on here? I demand an explanation.
This clumsy fool tried to plant that ridiculous camera on me.
Yeah, you bet your sweets, Mr. Commie. Look at this, Mr. President. This lousy commie rat was taking pictures with this thing on the big board.
Mr. Ambassador, this clumsy fool attempted to plant that ridiculous camera on me.
That's a damn lie. I saw him with my own eyes.
Gentlemen, this is outrageous. I have never heard of such behavior in the war room before.
Mr. President, I think they're getting him on the line.
just go out.
Yeah. What are you doing with the Daily Worker?
Your Ned must have left it here.
Your boyfriend reads the Daily Worker? What is he, a communist?
He reads everything, you know. Ned's very well read.
Maybe he's just very well read.
A communist? Don't you think he probably would have told me?
Well, does he wear bland, drab, olive-colored clothing?
Yes. Yes, he does dress a little drab.
He's a communist.
Ah.
Hey, look at this. Exciting, uninhibited woman seeks forward-thinking comrade. Appearance not important. Appearance not important. This is unbelievable. Finally, this is an ideology I can embrace.
Each according to his ability, to each according to his means.
What does that mean?
Well, if you've got means and ability, that's a pretty good combination.
So what if I want to open up a delicatessen?
Well, there are no delicatessens under communism.
Whoa. Why not?
Well, because the meats are divided into a class system. You got pastrami and corned beef in one class and salami and bologna in another. That's not right.
So you can't get corned beef?
Well, you know, if you're in the Politburo, maybe.
I want a racing car set.
A racing car set!
Listen, you don't want that. Those are assembled in Taiwan by kids like you. And these Coleman pigs, they sell it for triple the cost.
But I want a racing car set.
Oh, don't you see, kid? You're being bamboozled. These capitalist fat cats are inflating the profit margin and reducing your total number of toys.
Hey, this guy's a commie!
Hey, keep it quiet! Where'd a nice little boy like you learn such a bad word like that, huh?
Commie! Traitor to our country!
Santa is not a commie. He just forgot how his good friend stuck his neck out for him to get him a good job like this. Didn't he, Santa?
Is there a problem here?
This guy's a commie! He's spreading propaganda!
Oh, yeah? Well, that's enough, Pinko. You're through. The both of you.
I got 2 kids in college.
Well, you can't fire me. I'm Santa.
Not anymore. Get your skinny ass out of here.
Thank you. We're done. I believe we're done.
Now we'll all find a nice place for dinner. There are many, I think, in town. Proceed. Thank you all for